Hi, my name is Les Jerome. I'm a tenured instructor, faculty of social work, University of Calgary, and the date is April the 10th, 2008. There's a reason for the date, which I'm going to get into in a minute. We wanted to present some information that is kind of unusual for folks to have. A lot of people don't have access to this type of information, and we wanted to talk about what would set the stage for later events, because these types of things are very important. It's not like something just happened somewhere, that there was preconditions towards it happening, and that there's very good reasons for things to happen, and that history itself was not a predestined sequential bunch of events, that some of it was very haphazard. There's people in the audience watching this who've gone through the Second World War, and I'll bet you that you very well remember that in the early 1940s it wasn't a done deal that, quote, we would win, as the Nazi expansion continued over Europe. For a long time it was anybody's guess. And that's kind of the way history really is. We look back at history and we think, well, this happened and then this happened, it figures. But no, it doesn't figure. Hindsight is everything. And so history happens. So we wanted to set the stage for some of the things you're going to be learning later in these modules. Just a couple of really quick words of intro. I was really pleased to do this project because it resonates very closely with myself. I'm from northern Manitoba, born in a Michif Métis community, and this colonization stuff started with me very young. I know now that a lot of people have a huge push and pull towards between cultures, between and among cultures, and probably my first exposure to that was my mom, who was a wonderful lady and who would sometimes talk very negatively about being, quote, Indian. I have lots of relatives who do that too. This was weird as a kid growing up in the 60s because Mom was so obviously Native, and she spoke Cree, and she knew all of the Cree stories. And as I grew up, I began to understand this strange phenomenon called colonization, which is a terrible dynamic that rips people apart. I was first introduced to the idea of colonization in about 1985 through a Native Studies course I was taking at the University of Manitoba. And Emma LaRocque gave me these ideas. And she actually had me read, sorry, should have had this up. This, I feel like an ad, called Prison of Grass. Prison of Grass by Howard Adams. It was the idea that introduced colonization to me. And it made me mad. It made me mad because they were talking about some people who just existed somewhere. They were talking about me. They were talking about my family. They were talking about my mom, my parents, my brothers, my sisters, my cousins, my relatives, my community. And when I read that book, it made me mad. It made me so mad that I read it again. And then after that, Emma LaRocque got me into the idea of looking at colonization as a global phenomenon. And that was a key point to my understanding how this thing works. And one of the reasons that I gave the date right at the beginning is that one of my interests is colonization. And it's kind of become one of my favorite enemies. And as I've wrestled with it for 25 years, I have different ideas about it. And a few years ago, a question that I had posed to myself was, what were the preconditions to this? And that's where this module came from. So that's kind of the history of myself in this. When I say that this is what I sort of think now, I hope that people watching this won't just take my word for granted. I hope that you'll go out and I hope that you will be angry, and I hope that you will be passionate, and I hope that you'll be concerned, and I hope that you'll go out and check for yourself. Go out and read and think. And this is kind of maybe like planting seeds, and you'll see what kind of trees grow. I'm going to come over here for a second, and I'm going to talk about some of the first things that I wondered in this colonization stuff. I don't know if you can see this, Christine. If we think about colonization as a means by which one group has taken over another group and kind of assimilated it into itself, that's the essence of colonization. So, again, to repeat, it's one group taking over another group and assimilating it into itself. This is something that humans have done forever. I don't know, Cro-Magnons came in at 70,000 years. They probably did, actually they did. Never mind. Humans have done that for tens of thousands of years. So, how and why would colonization happen? It's generally talked about that colonization takes place in 3 stages. Hope you can read that. So the 3 stages are number 1, military, number 2, economic, number 3, assimilation. The why part is that most generally, colonization takes place because of the need of resources. Sometimes from war, which would go back to resources. All of the writers who have talked about colonization talk about these 3 large stages, and sometimes we can talk about early colonial and then later colonial. But almost always, pretty much always, in what I've read, and I'm a big fan of reading everything. I'm a big fan of reading the Carthaginians, and God knows what, the United States and Indochina and Vietnam. It's almost always beginning as a military thing. And after the military piece is done, then there's an economic piece that comes in where by force, by power, the new regime assumes control over, I guess you could say, the defeated regime. And then after that comes the weirdest part about colonization, which is the assimilation part. It's weird and it's not. In the people watching this, there's going to be people who've got a little bit of history and a little bit of gray behind their ears, like I do. And when you have a little bit of an appreciation of history, you can really see this strange piece about how the assimilation takes place over time, so that children raised in a certain era know what they know. And they have no idea about the conditions that had happened before them. So the kids that are raised grow to normalize the world as they see it, which is probably the key to colonization. When you hook it up with economic, with military, and with a kind of an invisible thing that overrides all of this. You've obviously got to have the power to be able to do this. Now, for the purposes of today, we hear a lot about the West, and what's the West, and colonization in the West. The West refers generally to Europe, Mediterranean, and North America now. And this is the context of the West. How did colonization come from? What were the roots of colonization? And this is where the history piece comes in. Because, I hate to tell you this, but we're going to be talking about Roman history and Roman conquest. because the Romans were the first great colonizers. They were the first great colonizers. In fact, they were so effective that I'd like to read this piece to you from one of these books. Get a load of this. Think of this. Perhaps more than any other region, they mean globally, perhaps more than any other region, Europe stands as a stark example of the effects of a thoroughly successful colonization and assimilation. Today, very little remains of the original European tribal culture, destroyed and assimilated. That's out of a book by Dot Hughes on globalization. Now, let's think about what that's saying. They're saying that Europe is an example of the most completely successful colonization we can think of in the world today. And you think, well, how can that be? The reason being is that when we think about indigenous peoples, we're inclined to think about peoples, I don't know, in Africa, in South America, and maybe the indigenous peoples of North America. But the fact of the matter is that we're all indigenous peoples. Everybody is indigenous to somewhere. Swedes are indigenous to Switzerland. The Brits are indigenous to the United Kingdom. Originally, and it might sound strange, and don't believe me, the next time that Halloween rolls around, Google up the origins of Halloween, and what you'd find is a good example of one small piece of the remnant of original European culture. Original European culture was farmers who farmed and raised stock. And what did they worship? Well, before the Roman Empire came, and we're going to get into this more in a minute, they worshipped spirits of forest, harvest, weather. Isaac Asimov likes to write about Halloween in the way that when the Roman Empire came in and assimilated Europe, it brought with it the church. We're going to get into this in more detail in a minute. It brought with it the church, who was faced with a dilemma. At the end of October, October 31st, November 1st, was actually the start of the year for ancient peoples. And it was a very joyous time of the year because the crops had been in safely, the people are ready for the long winter. This is a joyous time. So people had celebrations to the spirits of harvest and home. And as the Roman conquerors came in, bringing the church, they couldn't make sense of this with the word of the one true God coming with the conquering armies. So what they did was that they turned the friendly spirits into evil presences. Now, please don't believe me. Check it out. Check it out on the origins of Halloween, and you'll find that Halloween is one example of a very small piece that has been mutated and contaminated over time as a piece of original European indigenous culture. And maybe that's a good place to start. I hate to tell you this, but here's where the history lesson comes in.